now live in Silver Spring, Maryland. Last year in February, my father began to complain of a cough, which increased in severity over the course of the year, progressing into him being confined to the home and dependent on an oxygen machine. He was still so severely winded from just walking from the living room to the kitchen to get a glass of water, even while on the oxygen machine. My dad's doctors diagnosed him with pulmonary fibrosis and stated that it was likely due to environmental exposure, given that my father has never smoked a day in his life. We laid my father to rest on September 4th of last year. How many more people must be buried before we're granted equal protection under the law? As stated before, 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. An African American family making $50,000 per year is more likely to live near a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 per year. We see the results of this in the rates of respiratory illnesses in African Americans. Even though we have lower rates of smoking, African Americans are more likely to die of lung disease. A recent study found that in the Bronx, an African American child is 5 times more likely to die of asthma than a white American child. Nationwide, African American children are twice as likely to die of asthma and 3 times more likely to be admitted to the hospital for asthma attacks. From what I understand, carbon pollution doesn't directly cause these health conditions, but rather it creates what some scientists call domes that trap, concentrate, and intensify the myriad of other toxins we breathe every day, some of us more than others. With the mercury, arsenic, lead, dioxins, and other pollutants that come from power plants in communities nationwide, these domes are effectively creating lethal gas chambers for communities. At the same time, we understand that carbon dioxide is the #1 driver of climate change, and these power plants are the leading emitters of carbon dioxide. Again, climate change affects us all, but its effects are felt hardest by communities and people who are politically, economically, physically, and socially vulnerable. When I did hurricane relief after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the throngs of folks who walked through the doors of the Disaster Recovery Center every day were largely African American. I also met scores of people with hearing impairments where my pathetic 1 year of sign language was their saving grace. But my presence and meager skills were pure happenstance, so what would have happened if I hadn't been there? I also met people with HIV and AIDS who went weeks without access to their life-preserving antiretroviral drugs. Overall, I've met hundreds of people who had to start their entire lives over with barely 2 pennies to rub together to do so. And scientists say that Katrina was only the tip of the iceberg. Regarding other effects of climate change, growing up here in the south side of Chicago, I lived in a community that would be considered to be a food desert, like so many other communities of color. This means we would have more immediate access to a Dorito or a Funyun than a leafy vegetable or a strawberry. We already see how this plays out for communities who are disproportionately suffering from heightened rates of obesity as well as hunger, and all of the health conditions that result from poor diet, including diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, etc. Access to affordable, nutritious foods will only lessen as climate change impacts agricultural yields here and abroad. Last year, we saw farmers in Illinois, Iowa, Mississippi, and beyond lose crops from due to flood and drought. Again, scientists say we've only begun to see these impacts. Finally, I visited coastal communities from Florida to Louisiana to Alaska, some of whom are already experiencing coastal erosion and several of whom are facing displacement in the next 20 years due to sea level rise resulting from climate change. The cost of inaction on carbon pollution is the health, livelihood, culture, economic, and social well-being of communities nationwide and worldwide, with vulnerable communities being hit first and worst. We need strong carbon pollution standards to ensure that newly proposed plants have controls in place that protect the well-being of us all. We must also make sure that our next step is also to regulate carbon dioxide from the hundreds of existing plants that are now polluting thousands of communities. The history of decades of pollution from those plants is one of the leading reasons we are now on the brink of catastrophic climate change. We must get the situation under control for all of our sakes. Thank you.
Can you spell your name into
Sure. My name is Jacqueline Patterson, Jacque.